Day 29 would be my last substantial day of cycling in Scotland. I had decided that I was going to end the journey at Oban and then get trains and ferries home from there. I started off day 29 though with the pre-breakfast cycle up Glen Nevis at the same time, as it happened, as lots of the hikers were setting out, so there was more traffic than I expected, but very well worth it. I don't know, probably added 15 kilometers to the day or something, because the views as you're cycling up are really spectacular, and quite a few places to pull in and admire it and snap a few shots. Then it was back to Fort William for a breakfast in the train station. There's a very good cafe doing breakfast in the train station before crossing Loch Linnhe on the smallest ferry of the entire trip. Here's my bike being tied to the outside of it, and there was only another couple of foot passengers, and here's me being quite nervous inside, looking at the bike tied to the outside and wondering if those knots will hold, or will my trip actually end with the sight of my bike falling off and sinking into the loch. Thankfully that did not happen. Got across successfully, and then it was cycling down about 15 kilometers on the other side before crossing again. Why do that, you ask? Well, if you stay on the Oban side, you're on a very, very busy, unpleasant main road. If you cross over, instead, you're on very beautiful single track road with almost no traffic whatsoever on it, running through woodlands along the side of the loch. Probably some of the prettiest scenery, in fact, of the entire trip, and also I had a beautiful morning for it. One thing to watch out for is that tiny passenger ferry from Fort William only crosses the loch, I think, three or four times a day. It's not very frequent, so do check the timetables well in advance. This is all part of Sustrans 78, a cycle route that runs from Campbelltown all the way to Inverness, and in fact I'd been more or less following it from Inverness without quite realising that's what I was doing. That's quite well placed for Ireland if you're going to take the Ballycastle ferry, so if you wanted to do a fairly straightforward cycling trip to Scotland that would last, probably about 8 to 10 days, you could get the ferry over and just cycle to Oban and then back down again. For the most part, you're completely off roads. Well, not completely off roads, you're only on quiet roads. There is the one diversion at the moment due to forestry works that stuck me on the main road for about 7 kilometres. The ferry across the loch at the Corran end is much more regular. In fact, it pretty much just runs back and forth for a lot of the day. Probably every 20 minutes or so there's a crossing. The one thing to know is that at least this summer it was being very unreliable. A ferry had broken down, had to be replaced. There was a long period where it wasn't running at all. So if you're thinking of doing this, you probably want to check that the ferry is actually running in advance. So then you come off that ferry and then you're coming onto the main road again. So the traffic here gives you an idea of what I dodged by doing that crossing. Sustrans is still running here, but it's on this kind of narrow path that narrows massively here, for instance, with the hedgerow. So it's a little unpleasant, particularly at the bridge crossings. But, it's manageable. It's okay. If you're used to cycling in traffic, it's fine because you are actually slightly segregated from it. And then once you get across that bridge, the first of 3 in the day, you end up on this really nice bit of route, which I think must follow an old railway line. That's just from the sort of inclines of the sort of level you associate with railway line greenways. At times that the railway line sections seem to end and you end up on much steeper sections, some of which are very interesting, it has to be said. So I'm not really sure about the history of this route, but it's certainly beautiful, follows the coast for a good while, and gets you all the way to Oban in a way that's mostly pretty pleasant. As I said, it's really only the bridge crossings that I wasn't keen on, and they were okay. If you were really nervous, I guess you could always just walk across. So, if all goes to plan, this is my last day with any significant cycling in it. I'm on my way to Oban. I did an extra 10 kilometre off route this morning on Glen Nevis, but the route to Oban's about 75 kilometres, I think. So that'll be about 85, which is funny because I'm actually at the point where I don't consider that much. But the plan is Oban, I catch a train to Glasgow, stay in Glasgow tomorrow night because there's no available bike trains on. Then I get a train to Ayr, then a train from Ayr to Stranraer, and then I cycle about 10 kilometres from Stranraer to the ferry, ferry to Belfast, cycle a couple of kilometres in Belfast city centre to the train station, catch a train to Dublin, and then cycle a couple of kilometres home from the train station in Dublin, basically. So yeah, I've about 50 kilometres ahead of me, maybe 55, and after that not much, providing all those train things come in, and basically that's the plan. It's slightly different from my original idea of going via Campbelltown. I think I explained that before in a video, but basically, to repeat, the Campbelltown ferries only run at the weekend. There isn't really a way I could make the distance to catch one this weekend. If I'm waiting till next weekend, then I'm going to have to, about 5 days to kill, basically. So I made the decision that I would get the train to Conrine, which was always, that was always a kind of plan B. It was also, if the whole thing became too much for me, was always my kind of opt-out at various points on the route. But fortunately I didn't need to do that, and ending the serious cycling at Oban also has the advantage that that is a loop, although I think Oban was day, so after Cullen's, but it's about day 7 or 8, so a loop with a tail to it. And yeah, so that's it. This bit of the cycle today is pleasant, on a cycle path that's a few metres away from the road with a nice bit of vegetation in between. There was about 6 kilometres there where it was right alongside the road, and it was a too narrow footpath with hedges growing out onto it for a while with a lot of traffic. That was quite unpleasant, but this bit is nice again. And there was a lovely bit this morning, but hopefully I'll have the time to put together some decent videos when I get back, using all the road footage I have and the stills, and give a decent account of the travel. I've been on the road so long that I don't know what day it is. So long that those early first few days, that seems like another planet. It's like another lifetime away or something. So that's pretty funny. And I'm very much looking forward to being home again and meeting people and socialising and all that sort of stuff that I haven't been able to do really here. I mean, gone to some pubs, but that's it. They tend to be more restaurant-like, but yeah, it's all going well. Hiya! Passing the occasional other cyclist, but that was a scooter. I think maybe one of those monopod scooters. Anyway, I shall flip this around into front camera mode again. I don't know how much of the scenery you can see, but it's very pretty on the other side of the lake. Hopefully at least some of the loch. Hopefully at least some of it was getting into shot there from time to time. At this point, the cycle track descended to the road again, and as it turned back up into the hills, I spotted a hotel, so I treated myself to mussels for lunch again, and then set off. Around now, I was also looking at the forecasts and noticing that there was some heavy rain coming in the afternoon, but at this point it was still pretty beautiful. Lots of very, very beautiful views across the loch. This section is coming off the road and runs, in fact, mostly through another valley before catching some quiet roads again. But it's also got another one of the most impressive bits of cycle track I've seen anywhere. The one on the Great Glen, the side of Loch Linnhe, yesterday being the other one, which is a switchblade section built up an incredibly steep hill into, I think, what's called the Laird's Forest. Yeah, here this is now. I mean, it's hard to capture hills on the video, but you can probably tell this is a pretty significant hill I'm going up, and it really does need the switchblade in order to get you to the top. And then at the top of it, you've got quite a long run through an old forest, which is very impressive. And then once again you cross the main road and possibly you're back on the old railway line following the coast again, just going by the inclines and the tunnels on it. But there's a nice bit of this where you're coming through the woods, you come around the corner, and there out in the bay is Castle Stoker, which is one of those famous scenic shots. So I stopped for that. I think the castle is privately owned, so it's not one you can visit, but a friend did say she'd been to a wedding over there and they'd had to row them over and back, which I'd say would add to the adventure, particularly on the way home. So then I stopped for a coffee, and it was yet another bridge on the road to Oban. Again, nasty bit of busy road, but then some very quiet road. Now it's interesting here because the closer I get to Oban, the more cyclists I'm encountering. So I suspect the Sustrans route near Oban is probably quite a popular tourist route. But very impressive, quite beautiful, and a third bridge coming up to cross. This one perhaps being the hairiest of the lot. Once across, though, it's a straight run into Oban along quiet back roads, which are very, very hilly, and also it absolutely lashed rain for this final 40 or so minutes. Perhaps a fitting end to the last of the serious cycling. So as I said, that was Sustrans 78. That keeps running all the way to Campbelltown, but I was ending here in Oban and treating myself to a last meal. I hope you've enjoyed all these trips. Do give the channel a follow and look out for my final video on getting the train home.